All right, Rabosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share, to thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Steve and Teri Czinn, for dedicating the shurim this month in memory of Steve's father, Bunim, Tzvi ben Chaim, Leah Sol, as a zechus for refuah sheleimah for her daughter, Ilana bas Esther, and for all the wounded of Eretz Yisroel, Yonason and Rachel Wolff for a complete and lasting refuah, for Refuel Yitzchak Baruch ben Esther, Jerry and Sora Wolasky, and the zechus for refuah sheleimah for Zecharya Dov ben Perel Shira, Azriel and Iris Miller. Azriel and Iris Miller, in the zechus of the holy soldiers of the IDF, and the merit of our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisroel. We thank all of our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for their incredible generosity. And Rabbi, with that, let us begin. Okay, not sure what's not working. Okay. All right, Rabbi, good morning. So today's daf is Ayin Zayin 77, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem at the Mishnah, top of Ayin Zayin. So obviously we are completing actually today, tomorrow, really tomorrow. Today and tomorrow, Meretz Hashem will round out the sugya of yichus, of ultimately genealogy. So the Mishnah says as follows: Bas chalal zachar psula minakuna. The daughter of a male zachar. Daughter of a male zachar. Got it. Right? The daughter of a male chalal. So remember again, we have just a typical case, not so well, it's typical for us now as holding in the sugya, not so typical. Kohen marries a grusha, they have a son, let's call that son Ruvain. So Ruvain is a chalal. So what's the halacha? The daughter of a chalal is pasul for kahuna. So in other words, the chalalos is passed down through the father. And the Mishnah says the olam, that is there forever. Yisrael shenasa chalala bito ksher lekahuna. On the other hand, if a Yisrael marries a chalala, their daughter is ksher lekahuna. So we'll say, so this is a very important distinction. Chalalos is passed down through the father, not through the mother. So if halacha l'maisa the father is a chalal, then ultimately again his daughter, his son is certainly a chalal as well, but his daughter is prohibited to marry to the kahuna. On the other hand, if halacha l'maisa a Yisrael marries a chalala, their daughter is totally fit to marry into the kahuna. Chalal shenasa bas Yisrael bita psula. So if a chalal goes ahead and marries a bas Yisrael, their daughter is unfit for the kahuna. Rabbi Yehuda omer bas ger zachar kebas chalal zachar. Rabbi Yehuda says the daughter of a male ger is just like the daughter of a male chalal. Meaning the same way that the daughter of a chalal can't marry into the kahuna, so the daughter of a ger can't marry into the kahuna as well. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, Yisrael shenasa giores bito kshera. Rabbi Eliezer says that if a Yisrael marries a giores, their daughter is permitted into the kahuna, ksher lekahuna. The ger shenasa bas Yisrael, ksher lekahuna. So we'll say it's interesting. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov holds like this. So we'll say, here's what we have. So by chalal is passed down by the father. So if the father is a chalal, then ultimately the daughter is not permitted to marry into the kahuna. Mother is a chalala, and she marries a Yisrael, daughter is totally fine. Rabbi Yehuda essentially equates a ger with a chalal. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says something very interesting. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, when it comes to gerim, as long as one of the parents is a natural born Jew, then ultimately, again, the offspring is permitted to marry into the kahuna. The ger shenasa bas Yisrael bito ksher lekahuna. Aval, we'll say first wide line, Ayin Zayin 77a. Aval, ger shenasa giores, but if a ger married a giores, meaning in this case both parents are gerim, then bito psula lekahuna. Ultimately, again, then the daughter is not permitted to marry into the kahuna. Echad ger ve'echad avadim mishuchrarim. This is true with the ger. This is true with an evad mishuchrar. Afilu ad yud doros. Even until 10 generations. I will say we spoke about the 10 generation concept in Friday's daf, where we spoke about this concept that a family could have the identity of gerim until the identity of gerus is lost. At what point is or forgotten? At what point is the identity of gerus lost? So again, the Gemara posited up until 10 generations. Achete imo mi Yisrael, until the mother is from the Jewish people. In other words, a natural born Jew. Now the Jews will say what this means is until either the mother or the father is a natural born Jew. So I will say, just to consolidate this, the position of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is that when it comes to gerim, as long as one of the parents is a natural born Jew, the child is fit for the kahuna. The only challenge you'll run into is if both parents are gerim, then ultimately, again, the child is not permitted to marry into the kahuna. That's the halacha. Oh, that's what those are in Yaakov. Rabbi Yossi says, Af ger shenasik yores bito ksher lakuna. And ultimately, Rabbi Yossi says, even if both parents are gerim, the offspring is permitted to the kahuna. So Rabbi say, so this is the major machlokis over here we have. So remember again, just to focus for a bit. Tanakama, first opinion, the Mishnah tells me that chalalos is passed down through the father. So if the father is a halal, then the daughter will not be permitted to marry into the kahuna. If the mother is a halala, doesn't get transmitted. That's halacha number one. Now we'll say part two of the Mishnah was what about gerim? So Rabbi Yehuda said that essentially ger has the same din as a halal. So therefore, again, if the father is a ger, then ultimately the daughter can't marry into the kahuna. If the mother is a ger, the daughter can marry into the kahuna. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov saying, as long as one of the parents was born Jewish, the offspring is totally fine for the kahuna. And then the extreme position, or his lenient extreme position, Rabbi Yossi says, even if both parents are gerim, the offspring is permitted to marry into the kahuna. That's our machlokes. Let's go. Says the Gemara, Maili Olam. Now we'll say, we're focusing now on the first line. The Mishnah said, Bas chalal zachar, psula min hakuna li olam. The daughter of a male chalal is prohibited to marry into the kahuna forever. The Gemara says, what does that mean forever? What would you have thought? Midi dahava mitzvi ve'adomi. I would have thought maybe chalalos is like a mitzvi or an adomi. What's halacha mitzvi and adomi? Ma lahalon la'achar shalosh daros. Afkan nami la'achar shalosh daros. Kamash will know. I will say mitzvi and adomi. You know they're allowed to convert, but they are prohibited from marrying into the general marriage pool for 3 generations. So I would have thought that perhaps maybe a halal should have the same halacha. Kamash malan know that a halal ultimately is a genealogical blemish that continues to be passed on generation to generation without pause. Good. Says the Gemara, sorry. Yisrael shenasa halala. So remember again, the next part of the Mishnah was if Yisrael married a halala. So remember again, in that case, the offspring is kosher. Says the Gemara, minahani mili. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. So clearly what comes out over here is halalos is a genealogical condition passed down through the father, not passed down through the mother. So the Gemara says, from when do we know that? Minahani mili. Amr Yochim Mishram B'Shimon Ne'amar Kan V'lo Yichalel Zaro Ba'amav. So it says over here, V'lo Yichalel Zaro Ba'amav. Ultimately, again, we're going to see, it's actually interesting. This phrase, Lo Yichalel Zaro Ba'amav, means literally his seed should not be profaned in his people. We're going to interpret that phrase a little bit differently in different contexts. Lo yitama bal ba'amav lahalon. Lo yitama ba'am ba'amav. The pasuk is talking about over here that if a Kohen is married to someone who he is not permitted to be married to, he is not permitted to become tamei first. So let's say a Kohen marries a grusha and then his wife dies, he's not permitted to go to that levaya. So the Gemara says, Ma lahalon zechar v'lo nekevos. Just like by the case of by the tumah by Kohen, it's talking about men and not by women. Afkan, so to by chalalos zecharim v'lo nekevos. Chalalos is only a din ultimately in men, not in women. And therefore, again, it is only the halal who passes down that genealogical reality to his daughter, and a halala does not. So the Gemara says, Elamiata, if that's the case, Bito shall Kohen Gadol tishteri, then ultimately, again, the Gemara says the daughter of a Kohen Gadol should be permitted. Now, which daughter of a Kohen Gadol? Rashi says over here, Mina Amana. Let's say a Kohen Gadol illegally marries a widow. So what's talacha? Perhaps again, she should be, this daughter, should be permitted to go ahead and marry into the kahuna. After all, miksiv, so the Gemara says, again, if you're telling me that the restrictions or the impact or the halachos, the strictures of kahuna really only apply to the men, don't apply to the women, so why shouldn't the daughter of a Kohen Gadol be permitted, even if her mother was a grusha? To which the Gemara says, Miksiv bino, does it say his son? Zaro ksiv. Lo yichalel zaro ba'amav. So Rabbi say the Torah speaks out the concept of lo yichalel zaro, his offspring. So you see over here that as much as chalalos is only passed down through the father, not the mother, other genealogical issues apply to the offspring of a Kohen. If that's the case, bas b'no tishteri, so ultimately the daughter of his son should be permitted. Gemara says, ksiv, lo yichalel zaro. Pasuk says he shall not profane his offspring, his seed. Makish zaro lo. Mahu bito psula. just like if the Kohen marries someone he's not allowed to, ultimately his daughter is unfit for the Kuhuna. Af bino bito psula kuna. So too, again, if there's a genealogical blemish like a halalos, that's created, that's passed down through the son. The son's daughter is also not permitted to marry to the Kuhuna. I bas bito tissar, so let the daughter of his daughter become a surah as well. Im kein gzera shava maya hanile. If that's the case, what good did the gzera shava do? So this is nukuda number one. And I will say, this is, we'll try to do the halacha l'maisa as we go through the sugya. This is the halacha. The halacha is that chalalos is passed down through the father, not through the mother. So if a chalal marries a Yisraelis, which is, by the way, a chalal can marry whoever he wants. A male chalal can marry whoever he wants, even a kohenes. Just the difference is whoever he marries, that offspring has chalalos as well. Now remember, who is that going to impact? It really is only going to impact a daughter, because a daughter then can't go ahead and marry a Kohen. But if you have a woman who is a chalala, so for example, a Kohen marries a grusha, and they have a daughter, she's a chalala, and she marries someone, that offspring does not have chalalos. So chalalos only pass down through the father, not passed down through the mother. But again, I will say, if you have ben achar ben, son after son after son from chalalos, just understand, there's no limitation. In other words, that genealogical issue keeps getting passed down generation after generation. Okay, so let's go back there. Chalal shenasa bas Yisrael bita psula. So remember again, if a chalal married a bas Yisrael, so remember again, you have a boy who's a chalal. Again, let's say his father was a Kohen, his mother was a grusha, and therefore again, he is a chalal. Now he marries a regular Jewish girl, totally permitted. They have a daughter. That daughter is a chalala, right, and can't marry into the kahuna. We already learned this in the beginning of the Mishnah. Bas chadal zachar psul min hakuna. We already learned this. It's redundant. You already told me the opening line in the Mishnah is that the daughter of a male chalal ultimately is not permitted to marry into the kuna. So why the need to restate it? To which the Gemara says, you're right. The olam aidi ditana reisha yisrael shenasa chalala. Since the reisha opened up with the case of the Yisrael that married a chalala, tana nami seifa halal shenasa bas Yisrael. So Mishnaic symmetry. It is redundant, but just to preserve Mishnaic symmetry, the Mishnah stated the case again. Maslisin delal Rabbi Dostai. So the Gemara says our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Dostai. What did Rabbi Dostai say? The sign Rabbi Dostai ben Yehuda Omer kishem shebnei Yisrael mikva tara lechalalos kach benos Yisrael mikva tara lechalalim. So Rabbi said this is interesting. Rabbi Dostai says the same way that Bnei Yisrael are a mikvah tara lechalalos. In other words, Rabbi say, if halacha l'maisa, you have a girl who is a chalala, right? So again, remember, Kohen marries a grusha. They illegal, but it works. They have a daughter. That daughter is now a chalala. That daughter marries a regular Jewish guy. What's the status of their offspring? Totally fine. So Rabbi Dostai says like this: the same way that a regular Jewish guy, so to speak, is a mikvah, right? He's a mikvah for a chalala. Kach benos Yisrael mikvah tara lechalalim. So ultimately, again, benos Yisrael. So too, again, a regular Jewish woman will also be, so to speak, a mikvah for a chalal. So Rabbi Dostai says, I will say, this works both ways. Essentially, Rabbi Dostai says, as long as the chalala spouse, or chalal spouse, whether it's the man or the woman, marries a regular Yisrael or Yisraelis, the resulting offspring is fine. So I will say, our Mishnah clearly doesn't reflect that view, right? Because our Mishnah says the only way it works is if a chalala marries a Yisrael, then their offspring is fine. But if a chalal marries a Yisraelis, then ultimately the chalalos is passed down. So our Mishnah doesn't reflect the view of Rabbi Dostai. My time is Rabbi Dostai. Rabbi Huda, why does Rabbi Dostai hold that as long as one of the spouses is a Yisrael, then the offspring is totally fine? Amrakra, lo yechalel zaro ba'amav. This is interesting. Ba'am echad hu demechol, b'shnei amamin eino mechol. So we'll say this fascinating. Rabbi Dostai's logic is like this. The only time that chalalos gets passed on Rabbi Dostai posits is when both parents are chalalim. Fascinating. If both parents are chalalim, then the offspring becomes a chalal. But ultimately, again, if only one parent is a chalal, then by definition, the other genealogically pure parent ultimately takes care of the offspring, and no chalalos is passed down. So we'll say, again, we don't hold like Rabbi Dostai, but a fascinating shita just to keep in mind. Incredible. We'll say, I'll just point out also the lashon over here, Rabbi Dostai, is such a beautiful lashon. Shebnei Yisrael, K'shem Shebnei Yisrael, mikva taira lechalalos. Right? The lashon that Klal Yisrael itself is a mikvah tara. Right? The Gemara, Rabbi Dostai compares the Jewish people to a mikvah. So Rabbi Dostai said there's a beautiful, beautiful insight in the Gemara Maseches Yoma, discussing the power of tshuva. Says ma mikvah metares atmeim kach hakodesh baruch hu metaher as achodim. The same way that the mikvah purifies those who sin, so too the Ribono Shel Olam is able to purify those who go ahead and sin. I'm sorry. Just like the mikvah purifies those who are tamei, who are ritually impure, so too HaKadosh Baruch Hu has the ability to go ahead and purify those who sin. And the Mishnah quotes the pasuk, Mikveh Yisrael Hashem, that the Ribono Shel Olam is the mikvah of Klal Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the mikvah of Klal Yisrael. So Rabbi Yisrael Berjin said, you see two things over here. There are three things that are called the mikvah in this world. A mikvah is a mikvah, right? Number two, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a mikvah. And number three, Klal Yisrael is a mikvah. Klal Yisrael is a mikvah. Mikveh Yisrael Hashem. Hashem is a mikvah, Klal Yisrael is a mikvah. So the Rishner said something so beautiful. The Rishner said, you know how it works with a mikvah, right? In order for the mikvah to work, what has to happen? A person has to fully immerse themselves in it. Right? If you just, dip your toe in the mikvah, it's not the pshat that the TORAH spreads throughout your body. In order for a mikvah to work, you have to be fully immersed. So the Rabbi Shmuel Silber, a Hilgarish said, it's the same thing with using HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a mikvah and using Klal Yisrael as a mikvah. If you want the Ribono Shel Olam to be your mikvah, you have to be all in. You have to be all in. Throw yourself into HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, all in doesn't mean I'm perfect. And all in doesn't mean that I'm always doing what I'm supposed to do. But all in means I'm in. Ribono Shel Olam, I'm in. I will say, if you want Klal Yisrael to be your mikvah, then what does that mean? You have to be all in. You have to be all into Achdus. You have to be all into your people. You have to be committed to the Am, the good parts of the Am, the not so good parts of the Am. You have to be fully immersed in Klal Yisrael. In fact, he used to say about the Rishner that on Simchas Torah, when the Hasidim were dancing, and they formed a circle around him, they would see the Rishner going like this, going up and down, up and down, up and down. He said, Rebbe, what are you doing? He said, I am immersing in the mikvah of Klal Yisrael. I'm immersing in the mikvah of Klal Yisrael. They'll say, the mikvah only works if you're all in. If you're all into the water, if you're all into HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if you're all in for Klal Yisrael, then again you get to be zocher to that triple immersion. The immersion of the regular mikvah, the immersion of the Ribono Shel Olam, the immersion of Klal Yisrael, but it requires my full commitment to my God and my full commitment to my people. Incredible. Says the Yimar Tan Rabbanon, Lo Yichalel Zaro. Pasuk says, don't profane your offspring. Ainli Elazaro. So I only know that the offspring of a forbidden union ultimately again becomes chalolim. He atzma minayin. I will say, now remember again, there's another piece to this. A Kohen has a child with a Grusha. A Kohen marries a Grusha, has a child. So I will say, actually let's use Almana. Let's use Almana for Kohen Gadol. It's a good example. Right? Almana for Kohen Gadol. So remember again, a Kohen Gadol marries an Almana, illegal. So their offspring is going to be a halal, but the woman herself, the Almana herself is now a halala. So let's say the Kohen Gadol dies, so technically speaking, an Almana is normally allowed to go ahead and marry a regular Kohen. This woman cannot, because she herself has become psula as a result of the forbidden union. Where do we know that from? So the Gemara says, Amit Kavachomer, it's Kavachomer, Mazaro Shalo Avra Avera Mischalel. So the offspring, which didn't do anything wrong, yet it becomes a Chalal. He asked Moshe Avra Avera and Dinesh Mischalelas. Ultimately, she did commit Avera. So because she did commit Avera, certainly she's going to become a Chalala. To which the Gemara says, well, who asked Yochiach? The Kohen himself will prove that this is wrong. Sha'avra Avera. And we'll say, the Kohen himself, let's say the Kohen Gadol goes in and marries the Almana. So he himself did the Avera, ve'ein mischalal. Yet Rabbi say he doesn't become a Chalal. Now, interestingly enough, when a Kohen is in the midst or is committed to an illegal marriage, so the halacha is he's not allowed to do the avoda while he's married. But he does not become permanently disqualified. In other words, should he divorce this woman or should she pass away? Halacha l'maaseh, he's permitted to resume avoda. To which the Gemara says, Maluhu shekein ein mischal b'chol makom. That's different because ultimately, again, the Kohen Gadol himself, or excuse any Kohen, doesn't have the ability to be transformed into a halal. Tomar bihisha mischalalis b'chol makom. But a woman herself can become a halala. V'im nafshecha lomar, and if you want to say, Amekra, lo yichalel zaro. Bazik says he shall not profane his seed. Lo yichulal zeh shahaya kasher v'nischalal. So the Gemara says it means that ultimately, again, who could become mechulal? He or she who was kasher and then became a chalal. Mayim nafsh chalom. What does it mean the nafsh chalomar? Perhaps you could say, you could ask a pircha, the offspring itself, maybe it's different, maybe the offspring is different. Since the offspring itself, the entire creation of the offspring was a ma'aseh avera, Amakra lo yichalel, lo yichulal zeh shahaya kasha v'nischalal. So Rabbi say this drasha teaches us that the woman herself becomes a halala as a result of the illegal relationship with a Kohen. So lo yichulal means she who was kasher can now become profane. Tan Rabbanon, Ezo hi chalala. Rabbi say, what is a chalala? Kol shenolda min psulim. Anyone who is born ultimately again from psulim. Mar says, my psulim. What do you mean psulim? Ilema psulim lo. If you're talking about any woman who is puzzled to the man herself, hari machzir grushasa. What about the following case? So imagine the following situation. Reuben is married to Rachel. What happens? They get divorced. Rachel married. Now we'll say, is a couple permitted to get remarried after they get divorced? Absolutely. But now what happens? Unless he's a Kohen. Right? Now what happens? So now Rachel goes ahead and marries Shimon. Rachel marries Shimon. So what's the halacha? The halacha is now, at that point, if they get divorced, so then halacha l'maisa, Reuven can't remarry Rachel. They can't remarry. So let's say Reuven does remarry her. So what's the halacha? Hai machzir gushaso, de psulalo. Oh, I'm sorry. De psulalo, ultimately again, where she is puzzled to him, ubanek sherim, and ultimately again, in that case, halacha l'maisa, the offspring is still kosher. And this is interesting. So this is a case of in a legal marriage, right? Reuven remarries his divorcee after she was married and divorced from someone else. That's an illegal marriage. That ultimately, again, she's puzzled to him, but halacha l'maisa, the offspring are kosher. So you see, not every illegal marriage creates chalalim. Dichsiv toevahi, right? Toevahi, he toeva ve'in banei toavim. The relationship is a toeva, but the offspring are not. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Halikam Razul means to say, ezuhi chalala. What is the case of a chalala? Kol shenolda min psul kahuna. Any offspring that was born as a result of an illegal marriage. So I will say, any time you have illegality in a marriage to a Kohen, that produces chalalos. The Gemara says, nolda in, lo nolda lo. It's only if, Rabbi say, now here's what's interesting. So apparently the only time that chalalos takes place is when there was offspring. If there was no offspring, no chalalos. Hari amana ugrusha, zona, Rabbi will say, what about all the cases? Ultimately, again, if a Kohen or a Kohen Gadol marries someone who is illegal, right, that woman becomes a halala herself, even though, again, there's no offspring. Amarava, this is what it means to say, Hachi Kamar, Ezo halala muskeres, shalo hayala shasa kosher klal. What's the case of halala rabosai that the Torah makes reference to, of a person who was never genealogically fit? Kol shenolda min pasal kahuna or psula kahuna. This refers to someone who was born ultimately again from a union of psula kahuna. Fine. My muskeres. So what does it mean? What does Lashon muskeres was mentioned? Amar Yisrael Barav and Hachi Kamar. Ezo hi chalala sheikar medivrei Torah ve'insuichan lefarsha divrei sofrim. We'll say, what is the paradigmatic case of biblical chalala that is mentioned in Torah and does not need any rabbinic explanations? Kol shenolda min psulei kahuna. All right, so we'll say it's interesting. After all of this discussion regarding chalalos, what's now happening is the Gemara giving us a definition. Right? What is the definition of chalal or chalala? The biblical definition of chalala is any time a child is born of a union prohibited to the Kohen, ultimately again that offspring is a chalal. That's it, or chalala. Fine. Tan Rabbanon, almana. So I'll say the Gemara says almana. Almana. Actually, before we go on to this, we'll say. So therefore, just to be clear on what we have. So halacha l'maisa, remember, as I mentioned before, so we are going with the idea that halacha l'maisa, let me read it to you, that chalal shenasek. So remember, if you have two chalalim, just to clarify, if you have two chalalim marrying each other, then obviously their offspring are going to be chalalim, right? And remember, the chalalos genealogical blemish passes down generation after generation, right? So halacha l'maisa, this is true also. Furthermore, again, if you have a chalal who married a Yisraelis, ultimately again chalalos is passed down through the father. But if you have a Yisrael who marries a chalala, that chalalos is not passed down. It's not passed down. Good. So the Gemara goes weiter. Fine, that's it. We're just restating the halacha as we knew it. What's the interesting case here? Almana, eno chayv ela achas. So we'll say, if a Kohen, now it's not immediately clear what this case is, but literally what it sounds like, Kohen Gadol has relations with an almana, and an almana. Okay? Eno chayiv ala achas. He's only chayiv once. I will have to see the case. Grusha. He has relations with a grusha. Busy day. Eno chayiv ala achas. Right? Ultimately, again, he's only chayiv once. All right. So we'll say. So let's see what this means. Amana grusha v'chalala zona. Okay. He has relations with an amana, a grusha, a chalala, and a zona. Bisman shem keseder. If it follows that order. Chayiv al kol achas va'achas. Then it'll be chayiv for every single one, right? Zinsa v'nis chalala v'nis garsha v'nis armala eno chayiv ela achas. So Rabbi said. So here's what's interesting. That last case of amana grusha chalala zona, the Gemara seems to indicating is talking about one woman who has all of these identities. So if she has the identities in that order, she acquires the identities in that order, and he has relations with her, then ultimately, again, he's going to be chayav for each and every infraction. If, however, again, zinsa, v'nischala, v'niskarsha, v'nisarmala, but I will say, if halacha l'maisa, she acquired the identities in a different order, eno chayav ala achas. She's only chayav once. Okay, so let's analyze this. Amar Mar. So we'll say, let's go through the first case. Almana, eno chayav ala achas. So then Mar says, Hi almana. What are we talking about over here? Ilema sheba ala almanas Ruvain va'ala almanas Shimon va'ala almanas Levi. So if we're talking about where the Kohen Gadol literally had relations with three different women, right? Three almanas, three distinct almanas. Amai eno chayiv ala achas. So we'll say, why would he be chayiv only once? Amid base hare gufin mechulakim. We'll say these are three different women, and if they're three different women, then ultimately again, then obviously there should be three distinct levels of liability. To which the Gemara says, Ella, Sheba ala amana achas shalosh bios. Rather, I will say what it must mean is, it's the same amana, same widow, he had relations with her 3 times. So the Gemara says, okay, well, what's the case? Heichidami. Idolo asrube. If at the end of the day, there was no hasra, right? If there's no hasra, so pshita de'eno chayv ala achas. We'll say, in other words, if he only got hasra once, right? Or let's say again, there was no hasra, so of course there'll only be one liability. In other words, if there's no hasra, technically speaking, there's no liability. What the Gemara is saying is, assuming there's only one hasra, ultimately again, you're only chayiv once. Ela da'asru be'akol chada v'chada. Rather, it must be able to say what? They gave him hasra before every act. If that's the case, amai eno chayiv ela achos. Shabbos say, why should he only be chayiv once? In other words, if you received hasra before every single act, then halacha l'maisa, you should be chayiv for everyone. V'atanan, we learned, Nazir shaya shosi yain kol hayom kulo. If a Nazir was drinking wine the entire day, eno chayiv ela achos. Ultimately, again, he is only chayiv once. He's only chayiv once. Amrulo, al tishta bushosa chayiv kol achos achos. So we'll say, if they warn him before each and every act, then he's chayiv for each time. So again, even if it's the same woman that Kohen Gadol is having relations with, but if he receives hasra before every act, why would he not be chayiv for each individual act? To which the Gemara says, Lo tzricha sheba ala manas Ruvain, shahaisa manas Shimon, shahaisa manas Levi. Interesting, I will say. It's the same woman who was married to 3 different men. Right? So we'll call her Rachel. Rachel was married to Ruvain died. Rachel was married to Shimon died. And Rachel was married to Levi died. So she's an almana, interested she's an almana from 3 different marriages. So the Gemara says, and now Kohen Gadol has relations with her. So Ma'adisem, what would you have thought? Hari Shemos Michulakim. You might have thought, listen, maybe it should be chayiv 3 times. Why? Why? I will say why. Because she has 3 distinct widow identities. Right? A widow of Ruvain, a Ruvain of Shimon, a Ruvain of Levi. So I might have thought, therefore, because she has 3 distinct widow identities, therefore you should be chayiv 3 times. Kamashmala, no. Gufim mechulakim ba'inan v'leka. I will say the only time that a Kohen is going to be chayiv for distinct liabilities is one of 2 cases. Either if it's 3 different widows, or if it's 3 different acts and he received hasra for each individual act. But if halacha l'maisa, he has relations with one woman who was widowed 3 times, that's only considered to be 1 act of illegal relations, and therefore he's only chayiv once. Incredible. Amana, grusha, chalala, zona. So listen, now watch this. What happens? Well, it's the same woman, right? So Rachel is an almana, she's a divorcee, she's a chalala, and she's a zona. Now, I will say, now remember again, how do you get the identity of a zona? Remember again, zona is a specific halachic definition. Zona is a woman who has relations with someone whom she cannot marry, who she can't effect Kiddushin with. So it could be something as dramatic as having relations with her brother, right? Or it could be something like having relations with a non-Jew, right? Where halacha, right? Remember again, because you cannot effect Kiddushin with a non-Jew, so therefore that bia would make her a zona. So the Gemara says, now watch this. So the Gemara says, Hai Tana, my kasara. Now both say, now remember again, there, what the Gemara, now in that case, we'll say, remember again, what the Brisa said was like this. If halacha l'maisa, she acquired the identities in that order. She first became an almana, then a grusha, then a chalala, and then a zona. That's the way it's spelled out in the Torah. Bosai. Remember again, these are all women that a Kohen cannot marry. Kohen Gadol can't marry, right? So all women that Kohen Gadol. So again, if she acquires it in that order, then Einachinami, 1 bia will generate all of this liability. If, however, she acquires the identities not in this order, then you'll only be chayiv once. So we'll say that's analyzed. So Amana, Grusha, Chalala, Zona. Sahaitana, Maikasara. So we'll say, now, it was fascinating is there's this possibility, according to the Brisa, that Allah L'maisa, for 1 act of bia, the Kohen is going to be chayiv for all of these things, having relations with an almana, in the order, Grusha, Chalala, Zona. So what's the pshat? So Haitana Maikasavar, Ikasavar, Isser Chalal, Isser. I will say, if he holds, we've seen these concepts before, I will say, Isser Chalal, Isser means, if something is Asr, can another layer of Isser devolve upon it? So that's the machlokes. Isser Chalal, Isser, in Isser Chalal, Isser. So the Gemara says, if he holds Isser Chalal, Isser, Ipchanami. So we'll say, if you hold Isser Chalal, Isser, that literally, again, one prohibition could devolve upon another prohibition, then who cares what order she acquired these identities in? In other words, again, what does it matter? Amana, Grusha, Chalala, Zona, or Zona, Chalala, Grusha, Amana, who cares? One Isser could devolve upon another, therefore should be chayiv. So the Gemara says, V'ika savra in Isser Chalal Isser, and if you hold that one Isser cannot devolve upon a pre-existing layer of Isser, Afidu Keseder Hazeh Nami Lo. If that's the case of Osai, then again, one Isser can never devolve upon another, in which case the most you could be liable for is what? One of these prohibited identities. Amarava, so what's the case? Amarava, Hai Tana Savar Isser Chalal Isser, I'm sorry, Hai Tana Savar, Hai Tana Isser Chal Al Isser Lesle. Say Nachanami, you're right. Our Tana holds will say that in general, Ein Isser Chal Al Isser. Once you have an existing level of Isser, another level of Isser cannot go ahead and be superimposed on top of it. But what does he hold? Listen to this. Isser Mosif Islay. That's the will say. So we've seen this before. So it could be that in general, a person holds Ein Isser Chalal Isser. Now we'll say, let me go back for a second. If you hold Isser Chalal Isser, which means a new layer of Isser could go ahead and devolve upon a pre-existing layer of Isser. If you hold that, it doesn't really matter what kind of Isser A is, or Isser B is, or Isser C is. They just keep piling up on each other. If you hold Ein Isser Chalal Isser, then in general, one Isser could not devolve upon a pre-existing level of Isser. There might be an exception to this rule, which is when the second Isser is what we call an Isser Mosif. Isser Mosif means the second Isser is broader, includes something that the first one does not. So sometimes, even if you hold ein isser chal al isser, but if the second isser is an isser mosif, it adds on something, it's broader than the first, then ein achinami, it could devolve even upon the first. So the Gemara says, therefore, watch this. Almana, asur l'kohen gadol, v'shayr l'kohen hedyot. Now, we'll say, now watch this. So therefore, if you have a woman who's an almana, remember again, almana is prohibited to a kohen gadol, but permitted to a regular hedyot. Now, we'll say, now watch this. Havile grusha, so therefore we'll say, if this same woman now becomes a grusha, so remember, grusha we'll say is what? It's an isser mosif. Why is it an isser mosif? Because a grusha is not only prohibited to a kohen gadol, but also prohibited to a regular kohen as well. So we'll say, therefore you would say, miga di tosif la isur legabe kohen hedyot, itosif la isur legabe kohen gadol. We'll say, then we would say the same way that is a broader isser. Why? Because it applies now to a kohen hedyot. So the same way that the isser expands for a kohen hedyot, it'll also expand for a kohen gadol. The Gemara says, there was an interestingly enough, this woman is still permitted to go and eat truma if she is either ultimately again if she doesn't have children, right? So the Gemara says habile chalala. Now we'll say if she becomes a chalala, then we could say miga di tosef isur lemecha b'truma, itosef isur legabe kohen gadol. Now we'll say now you could say, but if she becomes a chalala can't eat truma. A further expansion of an isur. So it's in the same way that the isur expanded for the kohen gadol, it also expands. Elazona, my isur moses. So we'll say, see what's happening over here? You see, if you hold isur chal al isur, that one isur could devolve upon another isur, then the way in which she gets these identities doesn't make a difference, because one could always devolve upon the other. However, if you hold ein isur chal al isur, if you hold one isur does not devolve upon another isur, then the only way for one isur to devolve upon another isur is how? Is if the secondary isur is what we call an isur mosif. It's broader in scope than the previous one. So now the order makes sense. If the woman starts out as an almana is only a problem to a kohen gadol. If she then becomes a grusha, so now what happens? Grusha will say expansion. Bless you, right? Expansion. What's the expansion? It now applies to a kohen hedyot. Well, once it expands for a kohen hedyot, it also expands for a kohen gadol. Then, if she becomes a chalala, that's a further expansion. Why? Because now as a chalala, she can't eat truma. So the Isra has expanded. If it's expanded again for truma, it's also expanded for kohen gadol. The problem is when we get to zona, what's the expansion of zona? El zona, my Isra mosif islay, isba, Rav Chana barav katina, hoil v'shem znus posel v'Yisrael. All right, let's listen to this. When a woman becomes a zona, Rabbosai, zona is not only an issue vis-a-vis kahuna, but zona is also an issue vis-a-vis a Yisrael. A Yisrael will say, right? A Yisrael would also have an issue ultimately again marrying a zona. So that makes it an Isra Mosif. Now again, once it's Mosif, once it broadens its reach in Yisrael, it ultimately will devolve upon the Kohen Gadol as well. Incredible. So Tani Tana Kamid Rav Sheshet. Supposed to say first one line. Kol shehu b'yikach, harihu b'lo yikach. Kol she'ena b'yikach, eno b'lo yikach. So Rabbi will say, what's the halacha over here? So the Gemara says like this: any time that a person is obligated or is bound by yikach. Now we'll say the yikach that they're referring to over here is hu isha bivsula yikach. Right? Whenever ultimately again is a kohen gadol, whenever a person is obligated to marry a besula, which is only refers to a kohen gadol, he is subject to lo yikach. He's subject to these prohibitions of not taking an almana, a grusha, a chalala, and a zona. And whoever ultimately, again, is not subject to yikach, ultimately, against the Gemara, v'chol she'eno b'yikach, eno below yikach. Prat, l'kohen gadol sheba al achoso. So, achoso almana. So, where does this come to exclude? This comes to exclude a kohen gadol who has relations with his sister, who is an almana. I will say, now, what does that mean? So you might have thought that maybe there's liability for the fact that she's an almana. No, because since halacha l'maisa, she was never in the parsha ultimately of being able to become a wife to the kohen gadol, because it's his sister. Therefore, she's also not subject to the prohibition of almana. Okay, again, you still have the little issue of arayos, right? But l'maisa, there's not a problem of almana. Amarlei, the Amar says, Amarlei, the Amar lach money. Whose opinion is this? Rabbi Shimon, the Amar, ein isser chalal isser. Now, I will say this must be the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon holds ein isser chalal isser, right? Because again, if in other words, what the Gemara is saying over here is that halacha l'maisa, there is no prohibition of almana because she is already prohibited ultimately as his sister. This obviously reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon that one Isser cannot devolve upon another Isser. The Sanya, Rabbi Shimon says, Ha'ochel Nevel B'Yom Kippur and Pater. The is fascinating. Rabbi Shimon holds, if you eat an Avela, remember again, what's an Avela? The Avela is an animal that died without Shechita. If you eat an Avela on Yom Kippur, Rabbi Shimon says you're Pater. They will say, why are you Pater? Why are you Pater? You're not going to be liable for Yom Kippur consumption. Why? Because the item that you ate was already prohibited to you beforehand. Since it was prohibited to you as an Avela, so therefore the prohibition of Yom Kippur does not devolve upon this Nevela. Ein Isser Chal Al Isser. One prohibition cannot devolve upon a pre-existing condition. Incredible. The Rabbanan, because going to Rabbanan Ha'amri, Isser Chal Al Isser. The Rabbanan say, no, one Isser could devolve upon another Isser, and therefore if you eat an Avela on Yom Kippur, you'll be Chayiv ultimately again for Nevela and for consumption on Yom Kippur. To which the Gemara says, no. If you look at Rabbanan, you didn't need the Rabbanan. How so? Ki Ami Rabbanan Isser Chalal Isser. When did the Rabbanan say that one Isser can be Chal, another Isser? Hani Mili Isser Chamra Isser Kal. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. It seems to be, the way this works is like this. Even if you subscribe to the concept of Ein Isser Chalal Isser, that one level of Isser could devolve upon a pre-existing level of Isser, everyone agrees the second Isser has to have something unique. Right? There has to be something more. So, for example, the Rabbanon who hold Isser Chalal Isser, when is that so? That's only ultimately, again, Hani Mili Isser Chomer. That's only if the second Isser is more Chomer than the first. Aval Isser Kal, but Rabbi say if the second Isser is the more lenient Isser, then ultimately, again, Aval Isser Kal, Aval Isser Kal al Isser Chomer lo Chayo. It won't work. Ike Da'amri, others explain. Da'amri Hamani Rabbananu. Whose opinion is this? It's Rabbanan Da'amri Isser Chal al Isser. Isser Chal, Bechi Amri Rabbanan Isser Chal al Isser, Hani Mili Isser Chomer al Isser Kal. And what's even the Rabbanan? When did the Rabbanan hold the Isser Chal al Isser? That's only ultimately when the second Isser is more Chomer. So we'll say, see what's happening, something very interesting. Let's finish. Aval Isser Kal al Isser Chomer lo Chayo. Ultimately, because we'll say, if you have a secondary lenient Isser, that is not going to be chal on a more chomer primary isser. Di Rabbi Shimon, because if it's Rabbi Shimon, isser, the Gemara says hashta isser chamra isser kal lo chayil. According to Rabbi Shimon, we'll say ein isser chal al isser. So even an isser chomer is not going to be chal on an isser kal. So the Gemara says isser kal isser kamar miboy. Then certainly an isser kal is not going to devolve upon an isser chomer. So what would you have thought? Ma'al detema. I would have thought maybe isser kahuna sheni. Maybe the kahuna is different. And I will say maybe by kahuna, if you hold Isser Chalal Isser, maybe even an Isser Kal, a more lenient Isser, could devolve upon a more Chamer Isser. Kamashmala, no, it doesn't work that way. So I will say, I just want to find this out very interesting to you. So just to keep this in mind, what we're left with over here is a general machlokes about Isser Chalal Isser. Right? Can one level of Isser devolve upon a pre-existing layer of prohibition? And this could have so many different ramifications. So there's a machlokes. There's an opinion that says yes, and an opinion that says no. Now here's what's interesting. Even in the opinion of Osei that says yes, everyone agrees that second Isser has to bring something additional to the table. Something additional to the table. So whether it's that the secondary Isser is more chamer, or maybe the secondary Isser is broader, but it's got to bring something else to the table. Now, the interesting thing might be that even according to the opinion that says that Ein Isser Chalal Isser, that opinion might also agree in the case of what? Isser Mosif, right? In a broader Isser. Okay, just to keep in mind. Again, we're not coming to a conclusion in this machlokes. We're just kind of plowing through it a little bit. So we'll say, let's go weiter. Interesting case here. Good. Listen to this case. Yisrael habalachoso. A Yisrael has relations with his sister. Let's say you know that we've been doing this for a while. When just like the cases of incest are just the straightforward cases, right? So straightforward cases, right? So this is no other complications over here, right? Just Yisrael haba alachoso, right? So Yisrael has relations with his sister. Sazona mashvila. Chalola mashvila olo mashvila. So both say, here's what I know. Now both say, let's go back to what we said before. What's the result of that act? So leaving aside the liability, what's the status ramification of that act? So now the sister is a zona. We'll say, remember again, what did we say before? What's the definition of a zona? Anytime a woman has relations with a man with whom she cannot marry, she becomes a halachic zona. That's the technical. We think of zona much more as like a descriptive term of an immoral woman, but that's not halachically. That could be it also, right? But Labaisa in halacha, it's a technical category that refers to a woman who had relations with someone whom she cannot marry. So therefore, again, Reuven has relations with his sister Rachel. Ultimately, again, she is now a zona. What's the shaila? Does he make her into a halala as well? Interesting. Is she a halala? Right? Halala mashri or lo mashri. So miyar minan kalvachor mechavi lavin. So I'm sorry. Miyar minan kalvachor mechavi lavin havi halala mechavi krisis lakoshkin. And we can say like this. Remember, how does a woman generally become a halala? How does it work? I will say. So from a lav, a kohen marries a grusha. That's a lav. So if a relationship punishable by a lav creates a halala, then I will say all the more so what? All the more so a relationship punishable by kares. Right? Incest punishable by kares should certainly create halalos. Odama, ein halala ela mi iser kahuna. Or maybe not, we'll say maybe halala only comes from kahuna. Right? In other words, we'll say the only way to create the halal is how? If there's a kohen involved. If there's no kohen involved, you can't create halalos. Amrlei, ein is halala ela mi iser kahuna bilba. So he answered, no, the halacha is that there is no halalos except from kahuna. So that is going to be the rule. Only a kohen could create the halal. Again, no matter how terrible the prohibition is, even the Isser Kares does not create halal. It's incredible. How do I know that? How do I know that halalos only comes from kahuna? That has to be a kohen involved. Where do I get that from? The Sanya, lo yomar grusha bekohen gadol, the tisi bekavachomer bekohen hedyot. The Torah did not have to state the prohibition of grusha by kohen gadol. And I would have learned it out from a kavachomer, from a kohen hedyot. Va'anamina, and I would have said, hashtra the kohen hedyot, asura the kohen gadol miboy. So we'll say, again, if the Torah, and remember, all the Torah needed to do was to state the prohibition of grusha when it comes to a kohen hedyot, and I would have said that what? If a grusha is asura to a kohen hedyot, then what? She's certainly asura to a kohen gadol. So lama nebra. So we'll say, so why does the Torah go ahead and say, why does the pasuk say the prohibition of a grusha to a kohen gadol as well? Kashem shechaluka grusha mizona v'chalala b'kohen hedyot. To teach me the same way that ultimately, again, kashem shechaluka grusha mizona v'chalala b'kohen hedyot. The same I will say that ultimately, again, there are separate prohibitions. Ultimately, again, from a grusha from a grusha, zona and chalala by kohen hedyot, kach chaluka by kohen gadol. So too, there are separate prohibitions by a kohen gadol as well. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Kach chaluka, kashem shechaluka grusha mizona v'chalala. What's the first wide line? Hamuros etzel kohen hedyot sheyichid lav liatzma v'isha grusha miisha leika chulamdecha shem zona v'chalala grusha hiloka la af mishum grusha. So we'll say to teach us that halacha l'maisa, if one woman has all of these identities, ultimately, and the kohen has relations with her, he's chayav for each and every one of the prohibited identities. So too, again, by kohen gadol as well. Kach haluka by kohen gadol. To which the Gemara says, pshita. Well, it's obvious. Whatever is going to be true by a kohen hedyot is certainly going to be true by a kohen gadol. So the Gemara says, mikra gara. Would a kohen gadol be any worse than a kohen hedyot? Ela kashem shechaluka grusha mizona v'chalala b'kohen hedyot kach amona chaluka migrusha v'chalala b'zona b'kohen gadol. To which it's the same way that these identities are separate and distinct by a kohen hedyot, they're also separate and distinct by a kohen gadol. Lama nemra. So the Gemara says, Lama nemra in chalala ela mi isser kuhuna. So we'll say, so the Gemara says, so what? So I'm sorry, chalala lama nemra. So we'll say, salach lamaisa. What the Gemara is essentially asking is like this: if we already know whatever applies to a kohen hedyot is going to apply to a kohen gadol, so why the need to restate the prohibitions? To which the Gemara says to teach us the following. Chalala lama nemra, ein chalala ela mi isser kuna. So we'll say the restating of each of these things by the kohen gadol is there to teach us an important lesson. So what does the restating of chalala teach me? That chalala is only the result of a kohen involved in the relationship. Zona lama nemra. Why does it say zona? Nemra kan zona v'nemra lahalan zona. Ma kan zaro chulin. Afkan Zarochulin. To teach us that the offspring with the zona, ultimately, again, the offspring, halacha l'maisa, is going to be chulin. Again, the offspring is not damaged through the relationship. It's chulin, right? It's chulin. In other words, it's chalalos, but it's chulin. In other words, there's no mamzeros. Amar Rashi hilchach koina balachoso tap of ayin ches zona mashvila chalala lo mashvila. Therefore, Rabbi say halacha l'maisa. Going back to our original question, when a kohen has relations with his sister, ultimately, again, he makes her into a zona, but ultimately, again, not a chalala. Chazar uba if he has relations with her again, then asa chalala. Ultimately, I will say in that case, halacha l'maisa, he would go ahead and make her into a chalala. Look at Rashi. Rashi says chazar uba hu a kohen acher asa chalala she'asula mishum zona. So we'll say, so now watch, there's something very interesting happens. So halacha l'maisa, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is as follows. So let's go back. Let's take a step back for just a second. Right? So now remember, how do we get into this? We got into this by with the question of, if a man has relations with his sister, what's the impact of that prohibited act? So first of all, again, what we see is, he makes her into a zona. What doesn't he make her into? What doesn't he make her into? A chalala. Why not? We'll say, that's the whole point is, why not? Because chalalos, good morning, chalalos is only created ultimately again through kohanic involvement in a relationship. There's no such thing as chalalos without kahuna. So if a kohen's involved, then ultimately again a kohen could make her into a chalala. A Yisrael by himself, right? Even an Esther Krisos, an Esther Kares, ultimately again cannot create a chalala. They will say what's interesting over here is now the corollary to that case is if a kohen has relations with his sister, then I will say, what does he do? He makes her into a zona. Right? Ultimately, again, I will say, so that the logic over there is because remember, the prohibition of sister is a much more chamer prohibition, and that's why we look at that act of relations ultimately through that lens. So he makes her into a zona, and I will say, benala chalala. Now that she's a zona, we'll say now if she's a zona, if now a Kohen were to have relations with her, right, either that same Kohen, her brother, or another Kohen, then that second act of relations ultimately would make her into a halal. Okay, just an interesting idea. So we'll stop over here for today. So again, what do we come out with? Like, whoa, I don't know. What did he come out? So let's go back to the halachas that we learned. So first of all, we learned a couple of. We didn't get to the gerus sugyas. The gerus sugyas and Eretz Hashem are going to be tomorrow. But what we did get to are a couple of really very interesting and important halachas. Namely, number one, that halalos. Let's work backwards. Halalos is only created when you have a kohen involved in the picture. So again, no matter how severe the illegality of a relationship, it cannot create halalos if there is no kohen. So even in a case of incest, halach l'mais, again, the woman will become a zona, but she can't become a halala. Halalos requires kohanic involvement. Now what happens with halalos? Shabbos says, remember again, if you have a kohen who creates a halal, so halalos is passed down forever. So therefore, again, if halach l'maisa Ruvain, who Kohen marries Rachel, the Grusha, they have a son. That son is a halal. That halalos gets passed down. Halalos gets passed down. Now, when does halalos get passed down? When it's the father who's a halal. Then that keeps getting transmitted. What happens if the mother is a halala? So if the mother is a halala, then halach l'maisa, again, if she marries a regular Yisrael, no, if the mother is a halala and she marries a halal, then the halalos gets passed down. But if halach l'maisa, the mother is a halala and she marries a regular Yisrael, then what? Then ultimately, again, it ends. Remember, again, marrying Yisrael, that's the mikvah tara. So again, if both parents are halal, then it gets passed down. Father is a halal, gets passed down. But if mother is a halala but the father is Yisrael, the halalos stops. Elosai, tremendous. Shkoyach, we'll stop over here for today. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a good day, everyone. Shkoyach, everyone.